Sampson.
Good afternoon, Madam President. Delighted to be in the chamber this afternoon with my colleagues. It's pretty clear from watching the result in the House and speaking with some of my colleagues here that it's a foregone conclusion that this is going to pass and become our law in the state. But I do think it's important to just state a few things for the record. And my comments are going to be centered around the role of our state government, something that my House colleagues downstairs are very used to hearing me speak on, and I'm quite certain before the end of the session I will speak on it a few times. The first thing I want to state is that I am extraordinarily sympathetic to this population that is at issue with the bill before us. Certainly, no one wants to be in a position working for any employer where they're not being compensated on time and properly for the work that they're doing. The question really comes down to whether or not that responsibility falls to this body to do something about it. My first concern is that I heard a great many questions go unanswered in the House about the actual process. There were a couple of issues. First and foremost, I'll note that this bill is being e-certified, which implies that it is an emergency to the state of Connecticut. And while I certainly acknowledge it might be an emergency to some households in the state of Connecticut, there are many emergencies going on. People have flooded basements and cars that slid off their driveway because of the ice. But this is not an issue that is an emergency to the state of Connecticut that we needed to come in here today to pass this law. It should have gone through the proper legislative process with a public hearing, with the opportunity for public comment, so people can understand the ramifications of what we do here. Just a couple of those questions that I heard were unanswered, and the most important one, I think, is essentially what the state's responsibility is. The bill is pretty clear that it says that our responsibility ends at 10%, but there are still some questions about what happens after that responsibility is met. Do we just automatically turn the potential default over to the financial institutions who have agreed to offer these loans? Will the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority still have to play a role in collecting those funds? What exactly is the role of our state government, the CHFA, and to what expense to the taxpayers of Connecticut, merely just for the processing, let alone the collection of any debt? Another question that was asked downstairs is the priority of debt. If you've ever gotten a home mortgage loan, you know that that responsibility falls after the responsibility of the real estate taxes. When someone is foreclosed upon or they go into bankruptcy, that kind of thing, there is an order in which people have to be paid off. And I saw this question asked a couple of times in the House, and there was no answer to whether or not the responsibility to pay back this loan would come before the real estate taxes that might be owed by this person, or whether or not the unemployment compensation payments that are required to be paid back under this bill have to be paid back first. I think it's important that we answer these questions before we pass things into law. And that is the reason why we have a legislative process. That is the reason why we have committees. And I'm a firm believer that that process has value and we should follow it. My second concern about this particular proposal is that we've never done this before. There's been several other federal government shutdowns. One of my colleagues mentioned back in 1991 there was a RIF, which essentially is the federal government firing employees after furloughing them. And at that point, we still never did that. And I'm curious to know why we would be doing it now. Many folks have talked about why we're choosing this population to bail out. There are certainly other people in our state that are acting in good faith, who are working hard, and for whatever reason, their employers fail to pay them, and so on. But we have not included them in this legislation. There was an amendment offered in the House downstairs, which I think was the best possible solution. And I'm a little disappointed that it failed. but I will note that it failed very, very narrowly. I don't remember know what the exact vote was, but I believe there were 88 yeses, which is nearly half the chamber down there. Basically, that amendment kept everything we're attempting to do here intact, except removed the very, very small involvement of the state of Connecticut. My understanding is that this proposal came to us because some people in the private sector want to help. And I'm hearing it all over the place. There are news reports every day. I saw that if you are a furloughed federal employee who's not being paid, you can get free dog food. There are people out there trying to help. And I believe that there are financial institutions that would help. And I believe that even without our involvement and our agreement under this bill to take care of 10% of the potential default, which I think we all agree is actually extremely unlikely, because we're talking about people who the president has already agreed to pay, and the fact that they're probably better off federal employees than the average population. I doubt there's going to be much in the way of defaults on these loans. So my concern is not so much that they're going to default, it's the principle of whether or not this body has the right to commit the taxpayers of the state of Connecticut to any amount to pay for payments that are not the state's responsibility. These are federal employees. We have enough issue taking care of our own obligations regarding state employees and making sure that those items are met. At the end of the day, Madam President, I'm going to vote no today. And it's not because I don't want to help these folks. In fact, I'm very pleased that ultimately they are going to be helped. But I would argue that we didn't need to do it this way. If we simply enabled Webster Bank and others to go forward with this process without guaranteeing any part of it or involving the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, then they would do it anyway. And to me, that's the best way to do things, is when we are not interjecting ourselves or inserting ourselves into that process. I just cannot commit the constituents that I represent to any amount, whether it's likely or not, for this purpose. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator